Hey guys, tonight we begin with the London Blitz. Sirens at 8 p.m, thousands underground. House gone at dawn, every night for 57 nights straight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Though you might want to check that your ceiling is intact before we start. You'll understand why. Let's start with the sound, because before anything else, before the bombs fell, before buildings collapsed, before people died, there was the sound that announced it was happening again. The air raid siren. And once you've heard it, you never really unhear it. Picture yourself in London, the 7th of September 1940. It is early evening, around 5 p.m. You are having tea, or finishing work, or putting children to bed. Normal Saturday things. And then you hear it. That rising and falling wail. Mechanical and inhuman, designed specifically to trigger fear, not accidentally frightening. Deliberately frightening. A sound engineered to make you panic in controlled direction, toward shelter. Now, immediately, the siren starts as a low moan that builds to a shriek, then falls, then rises again. The wavering pattern was intentional, making it impossible to ignore, or tune out. Your body responds before your brain catches up. Your heart rate spikes, your stomach drops, your hands start shaking. This is Pavlovian conditioning happening in real time, except instead of salvation, the bell announces potential death. You have maybe 10 minutes from siren to bombs. Maybe. Sometimes less if the German bombers were already over the channel when spotters saw them. 10 minutes to grab essentials, grab children, grab anything you can't afford to lose, and get to shelter. Except you can't take much, and you never know what you'll come back to. So every time the siren sounds, you are making impossible choices about what matters most. The government recommendations were clear. Grab your gas mask, your identity papers, perhaps a small bag of essentials. Don't take valuables. Don't take pets. The official policy said pets couldn't enter public shelters. This meant families had to choose between abandoning their dog or staying home to die together. The number of people killed in their homes because they wouldn't abandon pets isn't documented, but witnesses reported it was significant. The rush to shelter was organized chaos. Thousands of people converging on underground stations, pushing through narrow entrances, flooding down escalators that weren't designed for panic. The official capacity of most station platforms was maybe 1,000 people. They regularly held 5,000 or more. The authorities initially tried to prevent people from sheltering in the tube, claiming it would damage morale and create dependency. The public ignored this completely and forced their way in, which was probably the most sensible collective decision London made during the entire war. The underground platforms became nightly cities. Imagine descending into a tube station around 6 p.m. and finding every inch of platform space already claimed. Families had regular spots they'd occupy, marked with chalk, defended against newcomers. You'd lay down your blanket or mattress if you'd managed to bring one. Most people didn't, and claim your 18 inches of concrete platform for the night. That was your space, your bed, your living room, your entire world until the all clear sounded. The smell hit you first. Thousands of unwashed bodies in confined space with minimal ventilation. The latrines were buckets behind curtains at the end of platforms, and they overflowed nightly. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, urine, feces, and fear. Fear has a smell, tangy and sharp, produced by stress hormones, sweating out of bodies operating in continuous panic mode. Add in the electrical smell from the rails, the damp concrete smell of the tunnels, and various food smells from people eating whatever they'd brought, and you get an olfactory experience that made breathing through your nose unpleasant. The noise was constant and layered. Crying babies, children asking questions, adults talking, snoring, coughing. The coughing was universal and continuous. The dust and lack of fresh air meant everyone developed respiratory issues. You'd hear coughs echoing through tunnels all night, a symphony of lung distress. Some coughs were wet and rattling, tuberculosis flourishing in perfect conditions. Some were dry and hacking, dust pneumonia developing in real time. Nobody stopped coughing. It just became background noise. You learned to sleep through. But underneath the human sounds, you heard the bombing. This was the truly terrifying part. The ground shook, not constantly, but in unpredictable intervals. You'd feel a rumble distant, like thunder, then closer. Then the platform would shake enough that dust fell from the ceiling, and you'd wonder if this time the tunnel would collapse and bury everyone alive. The tube was deep, yes, safe from direct hits, mostly, but the psychological effect of feeling bombs explode above while trapped underground created a special kind of terror. The children handled this in ways that broke adults. Some children adapted, treating it like camping, an adventure. They'd play games, sing songs, maintain innocence through circumstances designed to destroy it. Other children regressed, becoming non-verbal, clinging to parents, wetting themselves. Still others became eerily calm, dissociating from reality as protective mechanism. You'd see 5-year-olds sitting motionless for hours, eyes unfocused, gone somewhere else mentally, because being present was intolerable. The families with babies faced impossible situations. Babies cried, naturally, and couldn't be reasoned with or comforted easily. Other shelters would get angry at crying babies because sleep was already nearly impossible, and a screaming infant made it worse. Parents would try desperately to quiet their babies, sometimes smothering them slightly too much in attempt to muffle sound, creating risk of accidental suffocation. Some babies died in the shelters, not from bombs but from conditions, from disease, from accidents that happened when everything was stressed beyond functionality. The elderly suffered particularly. Lying on concrete for 8 to 12 hours caused bed sores, joint pain, circulation problems. Many elderly people couldn't lower themselves to the ground or get back up without help. They'd sit propped against walls for entire nights, unable to lie down, in constant pain, but safer than staying home. The mortality rate among elderly shelter users was high, but staying home was usually fatal, so they kept coming, despite knowing it was killing them slowly. The darkness during blackouts was profound. The tube stations had some lighting, but it was dimmed significantly to conserve power and maintain blackout protocols. You lived in permanent twilight, unable to read, unable to see faces clearly across platforms. People would carry candles or small lamps, but open flames in crowded underground spaces were dangerous. The dim lighting created an underworld atmosphere, thousands of people existing in shadows, faces lit from below, looking ghostly and half-real. Sleep was fitful at best. You'd lie on concrete, using your coat as pillow, your arm as mattress. The cold seeped through from the platform into your bones. Every time you shifted position, you felt the hardness, the discomfort. And just as you'd start to drift off, another bomb would explode somewhere, the ground would shake, or someone nearby would scream from a nightmare, and you'd be awake again, heart pounding, adrenaline flooding your system. The all-clear siren came at dawn usually, a steady single note, unlike the wavering attack warning. This was permission to return to surface, to go home, assuming home still existed. This was the moment of highest anxiety for many. You'd spent all night not knowing what was happening above. Your house might be gone, your neighbours might be dead, your entire street might be rubble, but you wouldn't know until you climbed those stairs and emerged into daylight. The exit from shelters was slower than the entrance. Thousands of people trying to leave through the same narrow passages they'd entered. Everyone exhausted, stiff, desperate to see daylight, but also dreading what they'd find. The crowd would shuffle forward, patient because rushing accomplished nothing. You'd smell fresh air mixing with the shelter smell as you got closer to exits, and then you'd step out into morning. The London you emerged into was transformed. The air tasted of dust and smoke. Everything had a grey coating, brick dust settling like snow. Buildings that stood yesterday were gaps today. Fires still burned. Water from broken mains created new rivers in streets. Glass crunched under every step, sidewalks carpeted with shattered windows. And the smell, distinctly different from the shelter, was burning things, a mixture of wood, fabric, rubber, and occasionally something worse. You'd walk toward home with other survivors, everyone silent or speaking in hushed tones. The normal sounds of London, traffic and conversation and city life, were absent. Instead, there was the crunch of boots on debris, the occasional collapse of weakened walls, the sound of fire brigade crews still working, and an overall eerie quiet that made you realize how much noise a living city makes that a dying one doesn't. Then you turn onto your street and your stomach would drop, because you'd see immediately whether your home had survived. If your street looked normal, you'd feel overwhelming relief tinged with survivor's guilt, because other streets clearly hadn't been as lucky. If your street was damaged, you'd approach slowly, counting houses, hoping yours was intact. And if your house was gone, just a pile of rubble where a building had stood for a century, you'd stop walking and stand there trying to process the impossible. Your home, the physical space that held your life, your possessions, your memories, reduced to broken bricks and splintered wood. Everything you owned that you hadn't carried to the shelter was gone. Photos, clothes, furniture, keepsakes. The accumulated evidence of your existence, now indistinguishable from the rubble of your neighbours' equally destroyed lives. The psychological impact of losing your home overnight was profound and often delayed. In the immediate moment, many people reported feeling numb, almost calm. The disaster was so complete that reaction systems couldn't process it properly. You'd stand there, staring at rubble, and your brain would refuse to accept that this pile of broken materials was your home. It looked like a construction site or a demolition zone, not the place you'd lived for years or decades. Later, sometimes hours later, sometimes days later, the reality would hit. You'd remember something specific, an object or photo, and realize it was gone forever. The baby shoes you'd saved, the letters from your husband at the front, your mother's recipe book, the specific cup you drank tea from every morning, all gone. Not lost where you might find them, destroyed, atomized by high explosive or burned in the fires that followed. This gradual realization of accumulating losses could break people in ways the initial shock hadn't. But you couldn't stand there processing trauma indefinitely. You had to keep moving. If your home was destroyed, you became officially homeless and would report to authorities for assistance. If your home was damaged but standing, you'd assess whether it was safe to enter. Many buildings that looked intact had structural damage that made them death traps. You'd see signs posted, "Unsafe, do not enter." These signs meant that home, though standing, might collapse at any moment. You could see your possessions through blown out windows, but couldn't retrieve them without risking your life. The recovery of possessions from damaged buildings was a particular cruelty. You could see your things right there, but accessing them was dangerous or forbidden. Some people risked it anyway, climbing through unstable structures to retrieve treasured items. Some succeeded. Some were killed when weakened floors or ceilings collapsed. You'd hear stories of people dying to retrieve a photo album or a piece of jewelry, and you'd judge them until you imagined losing every memory of your dead mother, and then you'd understand. The temporary housing arrangements were chaotic and inadequate. Rest centres were set up in schools and churches, providing beds and meals for the newly homeless. These were supposed to be temporary, a few days until alternative housing could be arranged. Many people lived in rest centres for weeks or months, because housing simply didn't exist. Entire neighbourhoods were gone, and you couldn't just create new homes from wishes. The conditions in rest centres varied from barely acceptable to horrific. Some were well run, with volunteers providing comfort and support. Others were overcrowded, undersupplied, staffed by overworked people, doing their best with impossible resources. You'd sleep on a cot in a room with dozens of strangers, your worldly possessions now fitting in a single bag. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a luxury. You adapted because the alternative was sleeping rough in bombed out buildings, which many did anyway. Now let's talk about what was happening above while you sheltered below. The bombers arrived in waves, usually starting around dusk when darkness provided cover, but enough light remained for navigation. The Luftwaffe would send 200, 300, sometimes 400 aircraft, each carrying tons of high explosives and incendiaries. This wasn't precision bombing. This was area bombing, designed to destroy as much as possible and terrorize the population into submission. The bombs fell randomly from your perspective. No warning where the next one would hit. No pattern to follow or predict. Just explosions appearing across the city in seemingly arbitrary locations. One street would be untouched, while the parallel street 3 blocks over was obliterated. This randomness was psychologically devastating, because it meant nowhere was truly safe, and survival was pure luck. The high explosive bombs, usually 250 or 500 kilograms, created craters that could swallow houses. The explosion would disintegrate the target building instantly, turning solid brick into projectile shrapnel, sending debris flying hundreds of feet. The blast wave would continue outward, shattering windows blocks away, collapsing weakened walls, killing people who weren't even near the point of impact through overpressure that liquefied internal organs. The incendiary bombs were smaller, often just a few kilograms, but devastatingly effective. They were designed to start fires, and they did this with horrifying efficiency. A single incendiary would burn white hot, igniting wood, fabric, anything flammable nearby. Firefighters developed techniques to deal with them, smothering them with sand or dunking them in water. But when hundreds fell simultaneously across the city, There weren't enough firefighters to stop them all. The fires that resulted created their own weather systems. Multiple fires in proximity would generate enough heat to create firestorms, where the rising hot air pulled in surrounding air so violently it created winds that fed the fires faster. People caught in firestorm areas described winds strong enough to pull them toward the flames, heat intense enough to melt glass, and smoke so thick that breathing was impossible. You'd die from smoke inhalation before the fire touched you, if you were unlucky enough to be caught in one. The 7th of September attack, the first major raid, provides specific horror to examine. It was a Saturday evening, unseasonably warm. The Luftwaffe sent 348 bombers followed by 6 17 fighters, targeting the East End docks and surrounding residential areas. This wasn't coincidental. The East End was working class, densely populated, and less likely to have proper shelters. The Germans were targeting the poor deliberately, either because they thought it would break morale faster, or simply because they didn't care. The bombers arrived at 5:30 p.m, wave after wave for hours. By the time the all-clear sounded, 430 civilians were dead, 1,600 seriously injured, and the East End was on fire. The fires were so extensive that German pilots coming back the next night used them as navigation aids. London was burning bright enough to be seen from occupied France, a 40-mile column of smoke visible during the day. That first night established the pattern. The sirens would sound, people would shelter, bombs would fall, buildings would burn, dawn would reveal the damage. Survivors would emerge to find familiar landscapes transformed into disaster zones. And then they'd prepare to do it all again because the bombing continued, night after night, for 57 consecutive nights, every single night. For nearly 2 months, Londoners went through this cycle of terror, survival, and trauma. The death toll mounted on average. 200 people died per night during the Blitz. Some nights were worse. The 17th of October killed 900 people in a single night. The 29th of December, the second Great Fire of London, killed fewer people, but destroyed the medieval city centre, including 19 churches. The total dead by the end of the Blitz in May 1941 was approximately 43,000 civilians, with 139,000 injured. To put that in perspective, more British civilians died from bombing in WWII than British soldiers died in WWII's Battle of the Somme. But statistics make death abstract. Let's talk about specific disasters that illustrate what those numbers actually meant, because each death was a person, and some deaths happened in clusters that devastated entire communities in seconds. Balham Tube Station, the 14th of October, 1940. The station was serving as a shelter, packed with hundreds of people sleeping on platforms. A 1,400-kilogram bomb hit the road above the northbound platform at 8:02 p.m. The explosion didn't just damage the tunnel, it ruptured a water main and a sewage pipe directly above the shelter. Water and sewage poured into the tunnel at massive volume, flooding the platforms where people slept. The survivors described waking to rushing water and screaming. The lights went out immediately. In pitch darkness, people tried to climb stairs that were already blocked by debris. The water kept coming, rising faster than people could move. 68 people drowned in that tunnel, not from bombs or fire or building collapse, but from water and sewage filling their shelter and drowning them in darkness, while above-ground life continued unaware. The rescue efforts took 3 days. When workers finally pumped out the water and reached the bodies, they found people who'd climbed onto rails trying to stay above water. People crushed in the stairwell stampede, families holding each other. The tunnel had become a tomb, and the images of recovery stayed with rescue workers for life. Many developed what we'd now call PTSD. Some never worked rescues again. The psychological toll on first responders was enormous and completely unacknowledged because keeping calm and carrying on meant suppressing trauma, not processing it. Bank Station, the 11th of January, 1941. A bomb hit the booking hall above the Central Line platform. The explosion collapsed the booking hall into the platform below, burying everyone sheltering there under tons of concrete and steel. 111 people died, many crushed instantly, others trapped and dying slowly as rescuers tried unsuccessfully to reach them. Some survived for hours in air pockets, able to call out, hearing rescuers digging, knowing help was close, but not close enough. And then they'd go quiet, one by one, as their air ran out or injuries killed them. Café de Paris, the 8th of March, 1941. This wasn't a shelter. This was a nightclub, underground, marketed as the safest restaurant in London because it was below ground. The rich and glamorous danced there, thinking depth meant safety. A German bomb penetrated through multiple floors and exploded in the restaurant at 9:45 p.m., right into the crowd. The bandleader, Ken Snakehips Johnson, was decapitated by shrapnel mid-performance. 80 people died in that blast, many of them young, wealthy, beautiful people who'd thought they were safe because they had money and connections. The bomb didn't care about class distinctions. The aftermath of Café de Paris revealed something darker. Looters arrived while bodies were still warm, stealing jewelry and valuables from the dead and dying. This was an isolated incident. Looting during the Blitz was common enough that authorities had to station police at bombing sites specifically to prevent theft from corpses. The Blitz spirit of everyone pulling together was real for many, but so was opportunistic cruelty. Human nature doesn't simplify neatly during disasters. Bethnal Green Tube Station, the 3rd of March, 1943. This one wasn't even from a bomb hit. A new type of anti-aircraft rocket was being tested nearby. The unfamiliar sound caused panic. People rushed to enter the shelter, pushing down the stairs. Someone tripped. Others fell on top. Within seconds, a crush formed. 173 people suffocated in a stairwell stampede, caused by fear of bombs that weren't falling. 62 of them were children. They died because panic plus stairs plus crowds equals physics that kills. And the war had created permanent panic that could be triggered by any loud noise. The authorities tried to suppress news of Bethnal Green, claiming it would damage morale or help enemy propaganda. The families of victims were told not to talk about it. This was common practice during the Blitz. Bad news was censored. Disasters were downplayed. Casualty figures were manipulated. The government needed to maintain the image that Britain was coping well, that morale was high, that the Blitz wasn't working. Sometimes this was true. Often it wasn't. The propaganda and the reality existed in tension, and people lived between them, knowing things were terrible, but being told to act like they were fine. Now, let's talk about the children, because children experienced the Blitz differently than adults, in ways that were often worse, because they lacked the context to understand what was happening, or the agency to control their circumstances. The evacuation scheme started in September 1939, before the Blitz began, anticipating that cities would be bombed. The plan was to move children from dangerous urban areas to safer rural locations. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it was traumatic for nearly everyone involved. Over 1.5 million children were evacuated in the first wave. By January 1940, when bombing hadn't yet started, many had returned home because separation was intolerable for both children and parents. And then the Blitz actually began, and the evacuation happened again, this time with real urgency and real trauma. Imagine being a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Your parents take you to a train station, pin a label to your coat with your name and destination, and put you on a train with hundreds of other labelled children. You are going somewhere you've never been, to live with people you've never met. And you don't know when you'll see your parents again. Your parents don't know either. They're crying, trying not to show it. And you are scared, but trying to be brave, because that is what you are supposed to do. The train journey takes hours. You are with strangers, adults who are supposed to be in charge, but who are overwhelmed by dozens of children in various states of distress. Some kids cry the whole way. Some are silent, shut down. Some try to run away when the train stops, thinking they can walk home. You arrive in some village or town you've never heard of, and you are lined up with other evacuees while local families choose who they'll take. This selection process was exactly as dehumanizing as it sounds. Host families walked along lines of children, picking the ones who looked healthy, clean, well-behaved. The pretty children were chosen first. The clean ones, the quiet ones, the ones who smiled. The last to be chosen were the scruffy ones, the ones who looked like they might be trouble. Some children were rejected by multiple families before someone finally grudgingly took them. The psychological impact of being repeatedly rejected by adults, while other children got chosen, is something many evacuees reported carrying for life. The host families varied dramatically in their treatment of evacuees. Some were kind, welcoming, treating the children like their own. These families provided safety, warmth, normalcy during abnormal times. The children who got lucky with their placements often remembered evacuation as positive, strange, but safe. A rural adventure that probably saved their lives. But many placements were terrible. Some families took evacuees for the government stipend, 10 shillings per child, and provided minimal care. The children would be fed less than the family's own children, given the worst rooms, treated as servants. Some were worked like farm labourers, which was legal, because helping on the farm was considered character building. Some were physically or sexually abused, which happened, was occasionally reported, and was rarely prosecuted, because authorities prioritised keeping children out of cities over protecting them from mistreatment. The evacuated children experienced a form of trauma distinct from Blitz trauma, but no less damaging. They were separated from parents during formative years, placed with strangers who ranged from kind to cruel, and lived with constant low-level uncertainty about whether their parents were alive. Letters took days or weeks to arrive. Visits were rare because travel was difficult and expensive. Phone calls were impossible for most families who didn't have phones. So you lived in limbo, not knowing if your parents survived the most recent raid, getting information days late, unable to do anything even if you learned they were hurt or dead. And then there were the children who weren't evacuated, either because parents couldn't bear separation, or because they didn't qualify for evacuation schemes. These children lived through the Blitz directly, experiencing trauma that shaped them permanently. They slept in shelters, saw destruction daily, lost friends and neighbours, and adapted to circumstances that should never require adaptation. Children normalised the abnormal because that is what children do. They incorporated bombs and death and fear into their play. Kids would play air raid, reenacting attacks, arguing about who got to be the bomber. They'd collect shrapnel as toys, which was dangerous because unexploded ordnance often looked like scrap metal. Multiple children died from handling bombs they thought were safe souvenirs. The normalization of violence in children's games worried some adults, but there wasn't much that could be done about it. The violence was real and constant, and children processed it the only way they could. The education system during the Blitz was chaotic. Schools were damaged or destroyed regularly. Teachers were called up for military service or air raid duty. Attendance was irregular because children spent nights in shelters and were too exhausted to attend school the next day. The curriculum adapted, sort of, but learning mathematics or history seemed absurd when you might die tonight. Some schools taught in shifts, using whatever buildings were available. Some stopped teaching entirely for periods. An entire generation received fragmentary, disrupted education, which affected their opportunities and outcomes for life. Children who lost parents in the Blitz became orphans in a system that was overwhelmed and underfunded. Some were taken in by relatives. Some went to orphanages which were understaffed and poorly supplied even before the war made everything worse. Some fell through cracks entirely, becoming street children who survived through a combination of crime and charity. The number of Blitz orphans isn't precisely known, but estimates suggest thousands of children lost one or both parents, and the support systems for them were inadequate. The long-term psychological impact on Blitz children is documented and severe. Many developed anxiety disorders, depression, attachment issues, and PTSD symptoms that persisted into old age. Studies done decades later found that people who'd been children during the Blitz had higher rates of mental illness, substance abuse, and relationship problems compared to those who'd been adults. The developing brain doesn't process trauma the same way as adult brains, and the damage done to children was often more profound and permanent than damage done to at least had fully formed identities before the war tried to destroy them. Now let's talk about what happened after the Blitz seemed to end, because May 1941 wasn't actually the end. The nightly bombing raids stopped. Yes, but that was when a new kind of terror began. The V weapons, the Vergeltungsweapon weapon, the Vengeance weapons. The V-1 flying bombs started in June 1944. These were early cruise missiles, basically pilotless aircraft packed with explosives, launched from occupied France toward London. The terrifying thing about V-1S wasn't just that they were deadly, it was the sound. The sound was everything. You'd hear the engine first, a distinctive buzzing growl that gave them the nickname buzz bombs or doodlebugs. As long as you heard the engine, you were relatively safe, because it meant the V-1 was flying over you. But the engine would cut out when the fuel ran out, and then you had 10 to 15 seconds of silence before it crashed and exploded. That silence was pure terror. You'd hear the engine stop, and you'd freeze, listening, counting seconds, waiting to learn if you were about to die. If you heard the explosion, you were safe. If you didn't hear anything after the engine cut out, you were already dead. This created a paradox where hearing explosions was relief because it meant the bomb hit someone else, not you. People learned to be grateful for hearing distant explosions, which is a psychological adaptation that speaks to how thoroughly the warped normal human responses. Over 10,000 V-1S were launched at Britain mostly at London. About 2,500 reached their targets. They killed about 6,000 people and injured 18,000 more. The randomness was even more pronounced than conventional bombing because V-1s couldn't be aimed precisely. They were pointed in London's general direction and launched. Where they hit was pure chance. No warning, no sirens, just sudden engine cut. Out followed by explosion. Then came the V-2, starting September 1944. This was worse. The V-2 was a ballistic missile, the first of its kind, travelling faster than sound. You didn't hear it coming. There was no warning at all. Just sudden explosion. Then the sound of the missile arriving after, because it moved supersonic. The first thing you knew about a V-2 attack was the blast, assuming you survived it. If you didn't survive, you never knew anything. The psychological impact of V-2s was different from everything else. With conventional bombs, you had sirens, warning, time to take cover. With V-1s, you had the engine sound, and those crucial seconds. With V-2s, you had nothing. Death could arrive literally without warning, faster than sound. And there was no defense, no shelter, no action you could take to improve survival. Odds you just lived your life and hoped that the next V-2 didn't have your coordinates. The authorities couldn't even sound sirens for V-2 because by the time you detected the launch, the missile had already hit. The government initially denied V-2s existed, claiming explosions were gas main accidents, which fooled nobody because gas mains don't explode with that much force or leave that kind of crater. The deception was abandoned after a few weeks because maintaining it was impossible, but the attempt showed how desperately authorities wanted to control the narrative, even when reality made it obviously false. Over 1,400 V-2s hit Britain, mostly London and surrounding areas. They killed about 2,700 people. The Hughes Mansion's disaster killed 134 people in a single V-2 hit on a block of flats. Woolworths in New Cross was hit while full of shoppers, killing 168. These were instant deaths. People going about normal Saturday shopping, wiped out without warning or chance of survival. You'd be buying groceries 1 second and dead the next. Vaporized or crushed before your brain could process what was happening. The V-weapons period from June 1944 to March 1945 killed about 9,000 people. Fewer than the Blitz, certainly, but the psychological toll was arguably higher because of the randomness and lack of warning. At least during the Blitz you could take shelter, feel like you were doing something. Against V-2s, there was nothing. You were helpless, waiting, hoping probability favored you, knowing that for some people it wouldn't, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The cumulative psychological impact of years of bombing created a population with what we'd now recognize as mass trauma. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis yet, but the symptoms were universal and obvious. Hypervigilance, where you couldn't relax because any sound might be danger. Exaggerated startle response, jumping at car backfires or thunder. Avoidance behaviors, refusing to go near certain locations. Intrusive memories and nightmares. Emotional numbing. Difficulty forming attachments. The whole DSM checklist, experienced by hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. Sleep disorders were epidemic. Even after the war ended, people had trouble sleeping. You'd spent years being woken by sirens or explosions, training your body to associate sleep with danger. That conditioning didn't disappear just because the war ended. People would wake at the slightest sound for decades, heart racing, convinced attack was incoming. The exhaustion from years of disrupted sleep never fully resolved for many survivors. The startle response was particularly notable. Sudden loud noises would trigger immediate panic. Fireworks were unbearable for many Blitz survivors. Thunderstorms caused anxiety spikes. Even planned loud noises like construction or celebration would trigger fight or flight responses that people couldn't control, despite knowing rationally that they were safe. Your brain learned that loud noises meant death, and unlearning that took years if it happened at all. Survivors' guilt was common and corrosive. Why did you survive when your neighbor died? Why did the bomb hit their house and not yours? You'd see their family grieving and feel guilty for being alive. Logically, you knew it was random chance, but emotionally you felt like you'd stolen survival. That should have gone to someone else. Someone better, someone more deserving. This guilt manifested in various ways. Depression, self-destructive behavior, inability to enjoy life because enjoyment felt like betrayal of the dead. The children who'd been evacuated came home after the war to parents they barely remembered and a city they didn't recognize. The reunion was supposed to be joyful, but was often awkward and painful. Parents had changed from stress and trauma. Children had changed from years away. The relationships that existed before evacuation no longer fit, and rebuilding them was difficult or impossible. Some families reunited successfully and adjusted. Others fractured permanently. The separation having been too long, the changes too profound. The physical reconstruction of London took decades. The destroyed buildings, about 50,000 of them, left gaps in the cityscape that scarred London into the 1960s and 1970s. Bomb sites became playgrounds for children, dangerous rubble, filled spaces where kids would play despite risk. Some bombs didn't explode and remained buried in the rubble, occasionally detonating years later when construction disturbed them. Even today, occasionally, a WWII bomb is discovered during building work and must be defused or detonated safely. The psychological reconstruction took longer or never fully happened. The generation that lived through the Blitz carried it for life. They were marked by it in ways visible and invisible. Some became cautious, risk-averse, unable to trust that safety would last, because they'd learned viscerally that it didn't. Others became reckless, fatalistic, figuring if they'd survived that they'd survive anything, or didn't care if they didn't. The trauma expressed itself differently in different people, but it touched everyone. The cultural memory of the Blitz became complicated and contested. The official narrative was fissured toward the Blitz spirit. This idea that everyone pulled together, stayed cheerful, refused to be broken. Keep calm and carry on. We can take it. London pride, and there was truth in this. People did help each other. Communities did support their members. There was genuine solidarity and resilience. But the Blitz spirit narrative also erased uncomfortable truths. It erased the looting, the panic, the times when people didn't pull together, but instead trampled each other in stairwells or stole from corpses. It erased the class divisions that meant poor neighbourhoods got bombed harder and had worse shelters than rich ones. It erased the government incompetence that left people unprotected and then blamed them for not being cheerful enough about it. The myth of universal cheerful resilience was comforting, but false, and believing it meant not processing the actual trauma or learning real lessons from what happened. The "Fine, keep calm and carry on" slogan, now famous, was actually barely used during the war. It was printed on posters, but the posters were never distributed widely because authorities decided the message was condescending and would annoy people. The slogan became popular decades later as nostalgia, as a way to remember the Blitz as quaint and inspiring, rather than as the sustained campaign of civilian terror that it actually was. The rebranding of trauma into inspiration is psychologically convenient, but historically dishonest. Now let's talk about what daily life looked like when you were trying to maintain normalcy, while your city was being systematically destroyed. Because the Blitz didn't just happen at night. The effects bled into every aspect of existence, making even simple tasks complicated and dangerous. The blackout was enforced from sunset to sunrise, every single night, whether bombing was happening or not. Every window had to be covered with thick blackout curtains or painted black. Not a sliver of light could escape, because even small lights could help German bombers navigate. Air raid wardens patrolled streets shouting "Fun put that light out" at anyone whose blackout slipped. Fines for blackout violations were severe, and repeat offenders could be jailed. Not because authorities were cruel, but because a single visible light could guide bombs to your neighbourhood and kill hundreds. Living in total darkness for 12 to 16 hours daily, depending on season, was disorienting and dangerous. You couldn't use streetlights to navigate because they were off. You couldn't use flashlights because they counted as lights. You walked in near total darkness, stumbling over curbs, walking into lampposts, colliding with other pedestrians. Traffic accidents increased dramatically because cars could only use heavily dimmed lights that barely illuminated the road. Pedestrians were hit by vehicles they never saw coming. You'd walk carefully, hands outstretched, trying to sense obstacles before you hit them. The darkness affected your circadian rhythms and mental health. Humans need light. Living in enforced darkness for years contributed to depression, vitamin D deficiency, and seasonal affective disorder, except it wasn't seasonal. It was constant. You'd wake up in darkness, go to work in darkness if it was winter, and return home in darkness. Sunlight became precious, something you'd stand in whenever possible, soaking up warmth and light like a plant, trying to counter the psychological weight of all that darkness. The ration system controlled nearly everything you ate. Bacon, butter, sugar, meat, tea, Eggs, cheese, jam, all rationed, starting in 1940. Your ration book contained coupons that you'd surrender when buying food, and when your coupons ran out, you couldn't buy more no matter how much money you had. The amounts were calculated to prevent starvation, but not to provide comfort or variety. You got 4 ounces of bacon per week, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 1 egg if available. That was it. That was your entire supply. The psychological impact of food scarcity was profound. You'd think about food constantly. What you'd eat when rationing ended. Recipes you remembered from before. Meals you'd cook if only you had ingredients. Food became an obsession. Not because you were starving, rationing prevented actual starvation, but because deprivation makes you fixate on what you can't have. Children who grew up during rationing reported thinking about food more than anything else, fantasizing about sweets and cakes and roasts they'd never tasted or barely remembered. The ersatz substitutes for unavailable foods were universally terrible. Powdered eggs that tasted like cardboard, margarine that looked like yellow grease and tasted worse, saccharine tablets instead of sugar that left a bitter chemical aftertaste, tea national loaf bread that was grey and dense, made with whatever flour could be stretched furthest regardless of quality. You ate these things because alternatives didn't exist, and you learned to tolerate food that would have been rejected as inedible before the war. The queuing became a way of life. Whenever word spread that a shop had something, anything, beyond basic rations, queues formed instantly. You'd see a queue and join it automatically without knowing what was being sold, because if people were queuing it meant something desirable was available. You might stand for hours waiting to buy oranges or onions or whatever rare item had appeared. Time spent queuing was time away from work, family sleep. But you'd do it because the alternative was going without. Work continued despite the bombing. Factories operated through raids. Workers staying at machines while bombs fell because production couldn't stop. The war economy needed constant output. Planes, weapons, ammunition, uniforms, everything. Factory work became doubly dangerous. You had the normal industrial risks of machinery and chemicals, plus the risk of bombs hitting the factory while you were inside. Multiple factories took direct hits, killing dozens of workers, instantly. But production schedules remained mandatory. You'd show up the next day to a damaged factory, step over debris from yesterday's bombing, and keep working. Office workers faced similar pressures. Businesses stayed open unless destroyed. You'd work in buildings with blown out windows replaced by boards, no heat because the systems were damaged, dim light to conserve power, and constant disruption from sirens and nearby explosions. Concentration was nearly impossible. How do you focus on accounting or correspondence when the building shakes from explosions every few minutes? But you tried, because normalcy was psychologically necessary, even when absurd. The commute to work became adventure and hazard. Your normal route might be blocked by rubble from last night's bombing. You'd detour, adding an hour to your journey, walking through streets that looked increasingly unfamiliar as more buildings disappeared. Public transportation was disrupted constantly. Bus routes changed daily based on which streets were passable. Train lines stopped running without notice when bombs damaged tracks. You'd plan for a 20-minute commute and arrive 2 hours later, exhausted before your workday started. The social fabric frayed in subtle ways. Friendships became difficult to maintain because meeting up required coordination that was increasingly impossible. You couldn't call easily because most people didn't have phones. You couldn't just drop by because their house might not exist anymore, or they might have been evacuated. Letters took days or weeks if the postal system was disrupted. You'd lose touch with people without meaning to. The friction of wartime existence, making connection too difficult to sustain. Dating and romance existed in strange forms. Young people still wanted connection, companionship, love, but the circumstances made everything complicated. You'd go on a date to a restaurant that might be bombed during dinner. You'd say goodbye to someone and genuinely not know if you'd see them again, because either of you could die tonight. This urgency made relationships intense but also fragile. People married quickly, sometimes to people they barely knew, because waiting felt like tempting fate. Many wartime marriages lasted. Many didn't survive the transition to peacetime when urgency faded and incompatibility became obvious. The sex that happened during the Blitz was often desperate and transactional. Prostitution increased as women lost homes and jobs and needed survival money. Soldiers on leave wanted comfort before potentially dying. Affairs happened frequently, marriages strained by separation and stress breaking down. The birth rate actually increased during the Blitz, despite terrible circumstances, perhaps because connection and creation felt like defiance of destruction. These wartime babies were often conceived in shelters or between raids, their first experiences of the world being sirens and explosions in utero. The morality shifted in ways that would have been scandalous before the war. Premarital sex became more common and less condemned because saving yourself for marriage seemed absurd when you might die tomorrow. Divorce increased, single motherhood increased. Society collectively decided that some rules mattered less than survival and connection. And while this was quietly liberating for some, it was deeply disturbing for others who felt the war was destroying not just buildings but the moral foundations of society. The crime rate fluctuated strangely. Some crimes decreased because opportunity was limited, but looting, as mentioned, was rampant. Black market trading flourished. If you had connections, you could get almost anything for the right price: extra rations, luxury goods, items that were supposed to be impossible to obtain. The black market was technically illegal, but so widespread that authorities couldn't really control it. You'd participate even if you considered yourself honest, because sometimes the black market was the only way to get necessities. And morality becomes flexible when your children are hungry. The propaganda posters were everywhere, bright and cheerful, telling you to make do and mend, dig for victory, keep calm and carry on, and be cheerful under all circumstances. The disconnect between the posters' sunny optimism and actual lived reality was stark and sometimes darkly funny. You'd see a poster showing a smiling woman with perfect hair cheerfully mending clothes, while in reality you were filthy, exhausted, wearing the same clothes for days because laundry was nearly impossible, and definitely not smiling. The propaganda wanted you to perform cheerfulness whether you felt it or not, because morale was considered essential to war effort, even if maintaining that performance required suppressing genuine trauma. The censorship meant you never knew the full truth about what was happening. Newspapers reported bombings but downplayed casualties. The BBC gave sanitized accounts of raids. Information about disasters, like Bethnal Green, was suppressed entirely. You knew things were bad because you lived it, but you didn't know how bad it was elsewhere, whether your experience was typical or exceptional, or whether the government was telling truth about anything. This information vacuum-bred rumours. Wild stories circulated about secret weapons, massive casualties being hidden, imminent invasion, peace negotiations. You couldn't verify anything, so you believed what you wanted to believe, or what your anxiety convinced you was true. The church attendance spiked initially when the Blitz began. People sought comfort in religion, praying for protection, finding community in congregations. But as bombing continued, many became disillusioned. Where was God while children drowned in tunnels? Why were churches being destroyed along with everything else? The theological problem of evil became urgently personal. Some maintained faith, finding meaning in suffering or believing death was transitioned to better existence. Others lost faith entirely, deciding that if God existed, he clearly wasn't interested in protecting London. The destroyed churches became powerful symbols. St. Paul's Cathedral surviving, while surrounded by destruction, became propaganda image, used to show British resilience. The famous photograph of St. Paul's Dome rising above smoke and flames suggested divine protection or national endurance, depending on your interpretation. But dozens of other churches were destroyed completely. Wren churches that had stood for centuries, medieval chapels, Victorian Gothic masterpieces, reduced to rubble. The architectural heritage of London was being erased, and with it, physical connections to history that could never be fully restored. The museums and galleries evacuated their collections early in the war, anticipating bombings. The British Museum's treasures were moved to quarries and country estates. The National Gallery's paintings dispersed to Wales. This saved irreplaceable art and artefacts, but left cultural institutions empty and vulnerable. The British Museum was hit multiple times. Galleries were damaged. Libraries burned. The destruction of cultural heritage was deliberate to some extent. German bombers specifically targeted landmarks to demoralize the population and erase British identity. Burning books and art is warfare against culture itself, attempting to make people forget who they were. The animals in the zoo faced particular cruelty. London Zoo killed all venomous snakes and spiders at the start of the war, fearing bombing might release them. The aquarium fish were killed when a bomb damaged their tanks. Larger animals like elephants and tigers remained, but lived in constant stress from the explosions. One elephant, Winnie, became neurotic, pacing and trumpeting in distress. The zoo itself was hit several times, destroying enclosures and killing animals. The zebra house burned, zebras screaming as they died in the fire. This suffering of animals was collateral damage that distressed many people, but couldn't be prioritized when human death was constant. The pets, as mentioned earlier, suffered because shelter rules forbade them. Thousands of pets were euthanized in the first weeks of war, owners making the terrible decision to kill their animals rather than abandon them or watch them suffer. But many people kept pets despite rules, hiding dogs and cats in coats, sneaking them into shelters, risking fines or rejection. The emotional support animals provided was vital, something warm and alive that needed care, giving purpose beyond mere survival. Some pets became heroes, like the dogs trained to find survivors in rubble, or cats that could sense incoming raids before sirens sounded, possibly detecting pressure changes or high frequency sounds humans couldn't perceive. The rescue workers, Arkansas P wardens, firefighters, and Home Guard members were overwhelmingly volunteers doing impossibly dangerous work. These were regular people, shopkeepers and teachers and clerks who trained part-time, and then responded to bombings with minimal equipment and no real preparation for the horror they'd encounter. They'd dig through rubble for survivors, knowing they might find corpses, or worse, find people alive but unreachable, trapped and dying slowly while rescuers worked desperately and futilely. The technical rescue work was brutal and traumatic. Bombed buildings are unstable, liable to collapse further at any moment. You'd be digging through rubble while walls groaned and shifted above you, knowing the whole structure might come down and bury you with the victims you are trying to save. The work was done with shovels and bare hands mostly, moving brick by brick, trying to reach trapped people before they died of injuries or suffocation. Sometimes you'd hear tapping or calling and work toward it for hours, finally breaking through to find someone alive and savable, and the relief and joy were overwhelming. But more often you'd break through to find bodies, crushed, burned, dismembered. You'd steel yourself and keep working, documenting what you found, trying to identify remains, treating human bodies with dignity, even when they were reduced to parts. The smell was the worst part for many rescue workers. Death smell, decay, mixed with brick dust and smoke. It got into your clothes, your hair, your nose, and you couldn't escape it. You'd go home and still smell it, lie in bed and still smell it, the scent of death, becoming your constant companion. The psychological toll on rescue workers was immense and unacknowledged. You were expected to handle horror after horror without breaking down, because breaking down meant you couldn't function, and functioning was necessary because people needed saving. So you compartmentalized, shut off emotions, became mechanical. Do the work, don't think about it, move to the next incident, repeat. This emotional numbing kept you functional during the war but damaged you permanently. Many rescue workers developed severe PTSD, alcoholism, depression, though none of those were discussed openly. You just carried the trauma and tried to keep living. The heavy rescue squads developed dark humor as coping mechanism. Jokes about body parts, about ways people died, about the absurdity of digging through tons of rubble to find someone who was dead hours ago. The humor seems callous to outsiders, but it was psychological necessity. You couldn't carry the weight of constant death without some release valve. And laughter, even grim, bitter laughter, was release. The camaraderie among rescue workers was intense, bonded by shared trauma that no one outside the service could understand. The ambulance drivers, often women, faced similar horrors. You'd be called to bombing sites and find casualties in conditions that required immediate triage. Who could be saved? Who couldn't? Who needed transport immediately versus who could wait? Making those decisions in chaos, in darkness, with limited resources, was impossible but necessary. You'd load wounded into ambulances, sometimes multiple casualties, a Volt vehicle, and drive through blacked-out streets, while buildings burned and bombs potentially still fell, trying to reach hospitals that were themselves frequently bombed. The hospitals were overwhelmed constantly. The emergency rooms designed for dozens of patients would receive hundreds in a single night. The staff worked 36-hour shifts regularly, operating on patient after patient until exhaustion made their hands shake, but they kept working because people kept arriving. Supplies ran short. Blood donations were constant but never quite sufficient. Anesthesia ran out and surgeries happened with minimal pain management. Morphine was rationed, reserved for the worst cases, meaning many people suffered through treatment that should have been unconscious, but instead was agonizing. The triage decisions at hospitals were even more cruel than at bombing sites. With limited resources, doctors had to decide who got treatment and who didn't. If your injuries were too severe, If saving you would consume resources that could save multiple less injured people, you'd be categorized as severe expectant, medical terminology for severe expected to die. You'd be given morphine for pain and moved aside to die while doctors treated more salvageable cases. This calculus, deciding some lives were worth less than others, based purely on resource efficiency, haunted medical staff forever. The operating theatres looked like butchery. Blood everywhere, multiple surgeries happening simultaneously, nurses struggling to keep up with the volume of work. Amputations were common because extremity injuries with major vascular damage couldn't be repaired with available techniques, so you cut off the limb to save the patient. You'd have piles of amputated arms and legs that needed disposal, treated as medical waste, but still recognizably human parts. The dehumanization required to function in this environment was protective during the work, but damaging afterward. The burned casualties were particularly horrific. Incendiary bombs and firestorms created burn victims with injuries covering huge percentages of their bodies. The pain of severe burns is indescribable, and pain management was inadequate. Victims would scream constantly, begging for death, and you couldn't help them much beyond morphine and dressings. Many died from infection days or weeks after initial burns, because antibiotics were limited and burn wounds were perfect bacterial breeding grounds. The ones who survived often had disfiguring scars and contractures that limited movement, making them disabled for life. The plastic surgery techniques that would later help millions were pioneered during the Blitz, developed by necessity to repair the most extreme facial injuries. Archibald McIndoe at East Grinstead Hospital became famous for reconstructing faces of burned pilots and civilians, creating the guinea pig club for his patients. But the techniques were crude by modern standards, requiring multiple surgeries over years, and results were never perfect. You might survive with a face, but not the face you had before, and adjusting to your new appearance, while also processing trauma of how you got it, was psychologically devastating. The morgues overflowed during heavy raids. Bodies would be lined up in rows, tagged if identifiable, left anonymous if not. Identification was difficult when bodies were burned or dismembered. Families searching for missing relatives would walk through morgues looking at bodies, trying to find their loved ones through clothing remnants or jewelry or any identifying features. The smell in morgues was overwhelming, refrigeration inadequate or absent, bodies decomposing in piles. The morgue workers developed the same dark humor and emotional numbing as rescue workers, necessary psychological armor against the constant presence of death. The mass graves were dug in several locations around London when individual burials became impossible during periods of heavy casualties. Bodies would be buried in trenches, multiple coffins, or shrouded bodies side by side. Quick services conducted for dozens simultaneously. The lack of individual funeral rites bothered many people, feeling like their loved ones were being disposed of rather than properly honored. But the scale of death made traditional funerals impractical, and adaptation was forced. The financial costs of death added to grief. Funerals required payment even during wartime. If your family member died, you needed money for burial or cremation, money that many people didn't have. The government provided some assistance, but it was minimal. Families would go into debt to bury their dead or delay burial while scraping together funds or accept paupers' burials that provided minimal dignity. The economic burden of dying was real and cruel, forcing people to make financial decisions while in acute grief. The property loss created long-term financial devastation for families. If your home was destroyed, you lost your life savings in physical form: furniture, clothes, tools, everything you owned. Insurance often didn't cover war damage, or if it did, payouts were inadequate to replace what was lost. You'd be left with nothing, forced to start over from zero, while simultaneously dealing with trauma and trying to maintain employment and family obligations. The economic recovery for individual families took decades when it happened at all. The government compensation schemes were inadequate and bureaucratic. You could apply for assistance if your home was destroyed, but the process involved forms, documentation, proof of ownership, and loss, all while you were homeless and exhausted and traumatized. The payments, when they came, were calculated at pre-war values which were lower than replacement costs. You'd receive £500 for a home that would cost £1,200 to replace, leaving you to bridge the gap somehow. Many never received compensation, claims lost in bureaucracy, or denied on technicalities. The class divisions that existed before the war were amplified during the Blitz. The wealthy could afford private shelters, reinforced basements, even evacuation to country estates where bombing was unlikely. The poor crowded into inadequate public shelters or stayed in their fragile homes because they had no alternatives. The East End, working class and densely populated, was bombed disproportionately compared to wealthier West End neighbourhoods. This wasn't entirely German targeting, though docks in the East End were strategic targets. It was also that poorer areas had more factories and infrastructure that bombing campaigns aimed to destroy. The resentment this created was real and largely unspoken. You'd see rich neighbourhoods relatively intact while your entire street was rubble, and you'd wonder if your life mattered less because you were poor. The government rhetoric was that everyone was equal in this struggle, all British citizens united against the enemy. But lived reality showed different. If you had money, you had options. If you didn't, you endured and hoped to survive. The Blitz ended in May 1941, not because Britain defeated the bombing campaign, but because Hitler redirected the Luftwaffe east for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. London had survived not through victory, but through endurance and German strategic recalculation. The bombing didn't stop entirely. Occasional raids continued, but the sustained nightly assault ended. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but also anticlimactic. You'd survived not because you won, but because the enemy chose to attack someone else instead. The return to something resembling normal life was jarring and difficult. You'd adapted to crisis mode, living hour to hour, day to day. When that pressure lifted, you didn't immediately feel better. Instead, many people crashed, the accumulated exhaustion and trauma hitting all at once. Now that survival wasn't requiring every ounce of energy, depression rates spiked after the Blitz ended, counterintuitively worse during the relative peace than during active bombing. The crisis had kept people functional through adrenaline and necessity. Remove the crisis, and the psychological bill came due. The phrase Sivan post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist yet, wouldn't be coined for decades. But the symptoms were universal among Blitz survivors. Hypervigilance, jumpiness, flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbness, difficulty with relationships, substance abuse as self-medication. These weren't considered illness. They were just how people were after the war. You were expected to readjust, to get over it, to move on. The concept that trauma required treatment wasn't mainstream yet. You just lived with it, or didn't. The women who'd worked in factories and served as art wardens and driven ambulances were expected to return to domestic roles after the war. This was jarring for many who'd discovered capability and independence during crisis. You'd operated heavy machinery, or commanded rescue teams, or performed surgery, and now you were supposed to be satisfied with housekeeping and child rearing. Many women found this transition impossible or unacceptable. The seeds of later feminist movements were planted partly by women who'd tasted agency during the war and refused to relinquish it after. The men returning from military service found a city and society they barely recognized. The London they'd left was different from the London they returned to. Neighborhoods were gone. Friends were dead. The people who'd stayed home had experiences soldiers couldn't understand, and soldiers had experiences civilians couldn't comprehend. The mutual incomprehension created distance in relationships that should have been close. Marriages struggled. Veterans and civilians lived in separate experiential universes, unable to bridge the gap. The children who'd been evacuated or lived through the Blitz directly were profoundly affected in ways that shaped the rest of their lives and influenced generations after. Studies tracking Blitz children into old age show lasting effects, higher rates of anxiety and depression, difficulties with attachment and trust, tendency toward hypervigilance and control, seeking behavior. The trauma was inheritable too, passed down epigenetically and behaviorally to children, and grandchildren who never experienced the Blitz directly, but grew up with parents whose parenting was shaped by it. The physical scars on London remained visible for decades. Bomb sites, rubble, filled gaps in rows of buildings, took years or decades to clear. Some were never rebuilt, becoming parking lots or parks. The architectural character of London changed permanently. Victorian and Georgian buildings destroyed were replaced with modernist structures in completely different styles, creating a patchwork cityscape where you could read the history of destruction in the inconsistent architecture. The St. Paul's Cathedral photo, the one showing the dome emerging from smoke and flames, became iconic symbol of British resilience. But focusing on what survived obscures how much was lost. The City of London was gutted. Entire neighbourhoods ceased to exist. The Blitz was catastrophic cultural, and historical destruction that no amount of resilient symbolism can undo. The buildings lost contained irreplaceable history, craft, beauty. Replacing them with functional modern structures restored utility, but not what was actually destroyed. The unexploded bombs, as mentioned, remained dangerous for decades. Even today, 80 years later, construction projects occasionally uncover UXBs that require evacuation and disposal. These bombs, buried in rubble or soil, remain live and dangerous, unstable from decades of corrosion. Several have detonated during defusal attempts, killing bomb disposal experts. The Blitz continues to kill, slowly, sporadically, but the threat never fully disappears. The environmental contamination from bombing was significant and long-lasting. High explosives contain toxic compounds that leach into soil and groundwater. Burning buildings released asbestos, lead paint fumes, and other hazardous materials that workers and residents inhaled for years. The health effects, cancers and respiratory diseases, developed decades later, making causation hard to prove but statistically likely. The Blitz killed quickly through explosions and fires, but also slowly through environmental poisoning that worked over decades. The generational divide created by the war was profound. Those who lived through the Blitz had shared experience that defined them collectively, but also isolated them from those who hadn't. You tried to explain to younger people what it was like, and they couldn't really comprehend it because the frame of reference was missing. How do you convey the specific terror of lying in a tunnel while bombs shake the earth above? You can describe it, but description isn't experience. The gulf between lived trauma and described trauma is unbridgeable. The veterans of the Blitz, both military and civilian, developed a particular set of values shaped by their experiences. Waste became intolerable because they'd lived through scarcity. Complaining about minor inconveniences seemed absurd because they'd endured actual hell and survived. This could make them difficult to relate to for younger generations who didn't share the context. Your grandparents' insistence on finishing every scrap of food, reusing everything, never discarding anything that might be useful, seemed excessive until you understood it was survival. Behavior adapted to peacetime. The nostalgia for the forbid spirit that developed later, the romanticization of wartime Britain as a period of unity and shared purpose, was partly coping mechanism. Remembering trauma as character, building or proof of national greatness makes it bearable. Admitting it was mostly horror, suffering, and random death that accomplished little beyond endurance is harder to integrate into national identity. So the narrative got smoothed, simplified, made inspirational. The complexity and darkness got edited out, leaving a cleaner story that is easier to tell but less true. The lessons supposedly learned from the Blitz were mixed and often wrong. The idea that bombing civilian populations breaks morale and ends wars was disproven by London's experience. Bombing made people angry and determined, not surrendering. Yet air forces continued to believe in strategic bombing, applying it throughout the war to Germany and Japan, causing massive civilian casualties that didn't achieve stated goals of breaking enemy morale. The lesson that should have been learned, that terror bombing is ineffective and primarily just kills civilians, was ignored in favor of continuing the strategy because militaries had invested in strategic bombing capabilities and needed to justify them. The nuclear age that followed remade the Blitz seem quaint by comparison. The firebombing of Dresden killed 25,000 in a night. Tokyo firebombing killed 100,000. Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed hundreds of thousands instantly. The Blitz's 43,000 dead over months was terrible, but became a footnote compared to what modern weapons could do in hours. This created strange moral calculus, where the suffering of Blitz victims was simultaneously honoured as terrible sacrifice and minimised as lesser compared to later horrors. The trauma Olympics of 20th century warfare made every suffering feel like it needed to be ranked and judged. The Cold War nuclear threat that dominated the second half of the 20th century created new generation of anxiety that referenced the Blitz, but exceeded it in potential scale. The public information films about nuclear attack, the advice to hide under tables or paint your windows white, felt like echoes of Blitz preparation, but with the knowledge that nuclear war would make the Blitz look like a skirmish. The 4-minute warning, the idea that you'd have 4 minutes from detection to impact to take shelter, was even shorter than the 10-minute warning of the Blitz sirens. And the shelters would be useless anyway against nuclear weapons. The survivors of the Blitz watched these developments with particular dread. They knew what bombing civilians felt like, and imagining it on nuclear scale was paralyzing. Some became peace activists, determined to prevent nuclear war, because they'd lived through a preview and knew humanity couldn't survive the full version. Others became fatalistic, figuring the world was going to destroy itself, and there was nothing to be done about it. The trauma of the Blitz informed their understanding of nuclear threat in ways that people without direct bombing experience couldn't fully share. The commemoration of the Blitz became formalized over decades. Memorials were erected, plaques installed, ceremonies held. The documentation of survivors' testimony became urgent as the generation aged and faced mortality. Organizations recorded oral histories, preserving first-hand accounts before they were lost. This archival work was vital but also painful. Survivors being interviewed would relive trauma while describing it, sometimes breaking down decades after events. The wounds not healed, just scabbed over. The question of whether the Blitz was worth it, whether the survival and continued resistance achieved anything meaningful, is complicated and depends on perspective. Britain didn't surrender, which prevented Hitler from consolidating control of Western Europe and focusing entirely on the Eastern Front. This arguably mattered for the war's outcome, but was that worth 43,000 civilian deaths? Is any geopolitical goal worth that cost? The people who died didn't choose to be sacrifices. They were killed while living their lives, and framing their deaths as meaningful contribution to victory can feel like retroactive justification for choices they never made. The counterfactual of British surrender is unprovable, but probably worse than what actually happened. Nazi occupation of Britain would likely have meant mass arrests, deportations, executions of Jews and political opponents, and integration into Hitler's empire. Resistance to the Blitz, the refusal to surrender despite terror, prevented this. But acknowledging that outcome doesn't make the suffering less terrible or the individual deaths less tragic. The greater good and personal catastrophe exist simultaneously, and neither negates the other. The technology developed during and because of the Blitz had lasting impact beyond warfare. Radar, advanced medical techniques, operations research, systems thinking for managing complex logistics, all emerged or accelerated from wartime necessity. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, was partly inspired by wartime medical organization and the realization that healthcare access shouldn't depend on wealth. So some positive developments arose from the crucible, though whether they required that particular crucible or could have emerged differently is unknowable. The psychological understanding of trauma advanced partly from studying Blitz survivors and combat veterans. The recognition that extreme experiences cause lasting damage, that people can't just get over it. That treatment is necessary and possible, developed slowly from observing and documenting trauma's effects. So the suffering contributed to eventual better treatment of trauma survivors, though again, this feels like cold comfort to the people who suffered without benefit of the understanding their experience would later provide. The literature and art that emerged from the Blitz captured aspects of experience that historical documentation can't fully convey. The novels of Graham Greene and Elizabeth Bowen, the paintings of Graham Sutherland, the poetry of Edith, Sitwell and Stephen Spender. These preserved the emotional and psychological reality of living through sustained terror. Art makes trauma communicable across the experiential divide, in ways that factual accounting sometimes can't. Reading a novel about the Blitz doesn't equal experiencing it, but it creates empathy that casualty statistics don't. The film and later television representations of the Blitz range from historically careful to wildly romanticized. The earlier depictions, made closer to events by people with direct memory, tend to be grittier and more complex. Later representations, especially those made for broad entertainment, often sand off the rough edges, making the Blitz into backdrop for heroic stories, rather than exploring the grinding terror and moral ambiguity. This gradual simplification through media is how history becomes myth, losing accuracy but gaining cultural staying power. The tourism that now exists around Blitz sites is ethically complicated. You can visit the cabinet war rooms, see where Churchill directed the war from underground, tour Imperial War Museum exhibits about civilian experience. This preserves history and educates younger generations, which is valuable. But there is something uncomfortable about packaging trauma as tourist attraction, about commodifying suffering for educational entertainment. The line between honouring memory and exploiting history is blurry and probably individually determined. The global context of the Blitz matters, but often gets lost in Britain-centred narratives. While London was being bombed, Leningrad was under siege, losing hundreds of thousands to starvation and shelling. While Britain resisted Nazi bombing, Poland was being systematically destroyed, its Jewish population being murdered. While the Blitz killed 43,000 British civilians, Nazi camps were processing millions. The Blitz was terrible, and acknowledging other simultaneously occurring horrors doesn't diminish it, but perspective matters. British suffering was real and significant, but not unique, or even the worst occurring at the time. The comparison between German and British bombing experiences is instructive. The Blitz killed 43,000 British civilians over the course of the war. Allied bombing of Germany killed somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 German civilians, with single raids on Dresden and Hamburg killing tens of thousands each. The moral calculus here is difficult. Does bombing British civilians first justify later more extensive bombing of German civilians? Is retaliation justice, or just more atrocity? The cycle of violence and counter-violence makes everyone both victim and perpetrator in varying degrees, and untangling justified from unjustified becomes impossible. The experience of German civilians under Allied bombing paralleled British experience. In many ways, the sirens, the shelters, the destruction, the death, the trauma. The human experience of being bombed is similar regardless of which side does the bombing. This doesn't equate moral responsibility for the war. Nazi Germany started and deserved to lose, but it suggests that civilian suffering is universal, and maybe bombing civilians is always wrong, regardless of strategic justification. This was not and still isn't the consensus view, but the Blitz and the later German bombing together make the case. The end of the war in 1945 brought relief, but not immediate happiness or recovery. You'd survived, but so much was lost. People, homes, years of your life lived in fear and deprivation. Opportunities missed, relationships destroyed. The victory celebrations were real, but muted for many who felt too exhausted and damaged to celebrate properly. The peace was welcome, but also strange, removing the structure that crisis had provided. You had to figure out how to live again in safety, and that was harder than it should have been because you'd adapted so thoroughly to danger. The recovery period, the late 1940s and 1950s, involved rebuilding physical infrastructure and trying to rebuild lives and society. Rationing actually got worse after the war before it improved, because resources were scarce and reconstruction was expensive and slow. The austerity continued for years, meaning the deprivation of wartime extended into peacetime. This made the transition less clean than imagined. The war ended, but its effects continued indefinitely. The National Memorial to the Few stands and various Blitz memorials exist, but there is no single central memorial to all civilian bombing victims, which some feel is oversight. The military dead are extensively memorialized, rightly so, but the civilian dead often get less prominent commemoration. This may reflect cultural discomfort with acknowledging civilian casualties, or difficulty in memorializing deaths that weren't chosen or heroic in traditional sense, but were just bad luck. The question of how to remember the Blitz remains contested. Should it be remembered as proof of British endurance and national character, as preventable tragedy that better political choices could have avoided, as shared trauma that deserves solemn acknowledgement, as historical event to be studied dispassionately? All of these are partly true and partly insufficient. Memory is always selective and shaped by present needs as much as past facts. The survivors, now almost all gone, as the last living memories disappear with those who were children at the time, carried the Blitz with them through their entire lives. It shaped their relationships, their values, their fears, their understanding of what humans can endure and what they can do to each other. They were the generation that saved the world according to common narrative, though most would tell you they just tried to survive and couldn't do anything else. The final lesson of the Blitz, if there is one, might be simply that humans can endure almost anything if they must. But endurance isn't the same as winning or even coping well. You can survive trauma and be permanently damaged by it simultaneously. Resilience and brokenness coexist. The Blitz spirit was real, the helping and solidarity and determination, but so was the panic and the selfishness and the permanent psychological scarring. Both are true. History is complicated, people are complicated, and trauma is complicated. The neat narratives we tell ourselves afterward are comforting, but incomplete. And here is what really stays with you if you try to understand the Blitz beyond the sanitized history. It is the specific individuals. The families drowned in Balham, the shoppers obliterated at Woolworths, the children suffocated at Bethnal Green, the rescue workers breathing in death for years until it killed them slowly with lung disease, the parents who never recovered from losing children, the children who never recovered from losing parents, the survivors who carried guilt and grief and damaged sleep for 70 years until they died still dreaming of sirens. These weren't statistics or casualties or collateral damage. They were people living lives that were interrupted and destroyed by decisions made by governments and militaries who valued strategic goals over human cost. And maybe that is always how it works. That war requires treating people as expendable, but understanding it doesn't make it acceptable. The Blitz happened. It had to be endured. Britain survived, but the cost was paid in full by people who didn't choose it and couldn't avoid it. And that cost included not just the dead, but the living who survived into damaged futures they'd spend their whole lives trying to rebuild. So when you think about the London Blitz, think about the sirens that still echoed in survivors' dreams decades later. Think about the smell of the shelters that never quite left memory. Think about children selecting children like livestock. Think about the 10 seconds of silence after a V-1 engine cut out. Think about emerging at dawn, not knowing if your home still existed. Think about it all, the terror and the tedium, the heroism and the horror, the survival and the cost of surviving. Because that is what it was, that is what the Blitz meant for the people who lived it. Not an inspiring story of national resilience, though that is part of it. Not a simple tale of good versus evil, though those existed, but a sustained campaign of terror against civilians that killed tens of thousands, traumatized hundreds of thousands, and left scars on a generation that never fully healed. And they endured it. They got up every morning and went about their lives as best they could. They protected their families, helped their neighbours, did their work, maintained connection and humanity in circumstances designed to destroy both. They survived. And that survival, that stubborn refusal to be broken completely, even while being damaged profoundly, that is what is worth remembering. Not as propaganda or inspiration, but as testimony to what humans had to endure and somehow did, at terrible cost. In a terrible time that we would do well to prevent from happening again. The specific mechanics of how bombs actually killed people deserve examination, because the abstraction of bombing casualties obscures the specific ways bodies failed under explosive force. A high explosive bomb created a blast wave, basically a wall of compressed air moving faster than sound. If you were close enough, the overpressure would liquefy your internal organs while leaving your skin mostly intact. You'd die instantly, but appear uninjured from outside, just lying there looking peaceful, except that every organ inside was pulped. This happened to hundreds of people. Further from the blast, the overpressure was less, but still lethal. It would rupture lungs, burst eardrums, cause brain hemorrhages. You'd die bleeding internally, drowning in your own blood as damaged lungs filled up. The time frame varied. Some died in minutes. Others took hours, conscious and suffering, while internal injuries killed them slowly. Field medics could do almost nothing, because the damage was internal and invisible and beyond 1940s medical capability to repair. The fragments, shrapnel from the bomb casing, and debris from destroyed buildings created the most visually horrific casualties. Metal moving at supersonic speeds would slice through bodies like they were paper. Decapitation was common. Severed limbs were common. Bodies torn in half were common. The rescue workers developed dark shorthand for body parts, keeping lists of what they found, where trying to match pieces to individual people for identification and proper burial. Sometimes matching was impossible, too many pieces from too many people mixed together. The blast wave itself could kill by blunt trauma, even without fragments. The force would pick people up and throw them into walls or onto pavement at lethal velocity. Skulls fractured, spines snapped. You'd die from impacts that happened too fast to process, your brain registering the explosion, but not the collision that killed you. Children, being smaller and lighter, were thrown further and died more often from blast displacement than adults, who had mass to resist the force somewhat. The crush injuries from building collapse created another category of horror. When multi-story buildings pancaked down, people on lower floors were compressed under tons of masonry. The pressure would squeeze bodies into spaces a foot, high or less. Bones shattered, organs ruptured. Sometimes you'd die instantly if the initial collapse hit your head or chest. Other times you'd be conscious, trapped, feeling your body being crushed incrementally as debris settled and shifted, dying slowly over hours, while rescue was impossible, because moving the rubble that was crushing you would cause further collapse that would kill rescuers too. The position matters for crush casualties. If you were upright when the building came down, your legs would be crushed first, pelvis fractured, but your torso might be protected by fallen beams, creating pocket. You'd be conscious, and aware but trapped and unable to move. If you were lying down, you'd be compressed flatly, likely dying faster but also more completely destroyed, making identification nearly impossible. The rescue workers learned to tell from debris patterns whether reaching trapped people was worth attempting or whether they'd certainly be dead already. The fire deaths were prolonged and agonizing. Incendiary bombs created fires that spread faster than people could escape, especially in buildings where exits were blocked by debris or panic, jammed with people. Smoke inhalation killed many before the flames reached them, which was merciful comparatively. Carbon monoxide would make you drowsy, then unconscious, then dead, without the pain of burning. But if you were trapped where smoke couldn't reach, or if fire spread faster than smoke accumulated, you burned alive, conscious, screaming until fire damaged your lungs enough that screaming became impossible. The specific sensation of burning alive is among the worst ways to die. The pain of burns is maximal because it directly stimulates every nerve ending in the skin. First degree burns hurt. Second degree burns hurt worse. Third degree burns destroy nerve endings, which seems like it would reduce pain. But the margins around third degree burns are second degree, and the pain from those margins is overwhelming. Your entire consciousness becomes pain. Nothing else exists, and death, when it comes, is release. The people who survived severe burns often said they wished they'd died. The pain during recovery, and the disfigurement after making survival, feel like punishment. The indirect deaths, caused not by bombs but by bombing's effects, added to the toll in less documented ways. The woman who died of heart attack during a raid, her weak heart, unable to handle the stress. The elderly man who fell in the darkness during evacuation and broke his hip, the injury leading to pneumonia that killed him weeks later. The child who died from disease contracted in overcrowded shelters where infection spread easily. These deaths were consequences of the Blitz, but weren't always counted in casualty figures, making the real death toll higher than official statistics. The suicide rate increased during and after the Blitz, though exact numbers are uncertain because wartime record keeping was disrupted and because authorities sometimes classified suicides as accidents to maintain morale. People who'd lost everything, family and home and future, would choose to end it rather than continue in circumstances that felt unendurable. This was particularly common among older people who'd lost spouses and couldn't imagine rebuilding alone. The suicides were quiet, unremarked, individuals opting out of survival that was too painful to sustain. The psychological deaths, people who didn't physically die, but whose personalities and mental functions were destroyed by trauma, created walking casualties who survived in body but not in mind. Complete mental breakdowns happened to people who couldn't process the sustained horror. They become catatonic, non-responsive, requiring institutional care for the rest of their lives. Shell shock, the WWII term, happened to civilians too. Same symptoms, different cause. The institutions that housed these psychological casualties were grim places, understaffed and underfunded, and many patients never recovered. Living decades in facilities, their lives effectively ended, even though their bodies continued. The children who witnessed extreme violence, parents killed in front of them, or pulling corpses from rubble, or being trapped in darkness while people died nearby, sometimes developed psychological damage so severe they never fully developed normal emotional and social capabilities. Attachment disorders, dissociation, developmental delays all flowed from trauma occurring during critical developmental periods. These children grew into damaged adults who struggled with relationships, employment, basic functioning, the Blitz having stolen their potential futures even though they physically survived. The specific environmental conditions inside a collapsed building affected survival time and rescue possibilities. If you were trapped with an air pocket, survival time was hours to days depending on pocket size and your physical conditions. You'd suffocate as oxygen depleted and carbon dioxide accumulated. The process was gradual. You'd feel increasingly short of breath, then lightheaded, then confused, then unconscious, then dead. If rescuers reached you while you were still conscious, you could sometimes be saved, dug out and revived. But as time passed, odds decreased, and after about 3 days, survival was nearly impossible, even with air, because dehydration would kill you. If you were trapped without air pocket, death came faster, but rescue was more difficult, because you'd be completely buried in rubble with no gap to maintain breathing. Suffocation under debris was quicker than in air pockets. Minutes to tens of minutes depending on how compressed your chest was, and whether you could move at all. The desperate attempt to breathe while unable to expand your chest. The panic as you realized you couldn't get air. The final resignation as consciousness faded. All happened in darkness and silence, and isolation, dying alone surrounded by tons of brick. The water main breaks complicated rescues, and added drowning to the list of ways to die. When bombs hit streets, they'd rupture underground pipes, flooding basements and lower levels of damaged buildings. If you were trapped in a basement when water started pouring in, you'd watch the water level rise, knowing you were going to drown, unable to do anything about it. The water was cold, filthy, mixed with sewage often, and rising slowly enough that you had time to understand what was happening. The final moments as water rose above your face and you could no longer breathe were extended terror, panic, drowning specific suffocating agony. Death taking minutes of desperate struggle. The gas leaks created another hazard. Bombs would rupture gas mains, and leaking gas would accumulate in enclosed spaces. Sometimes it would explode from a spark, killing everyone in secondary blast. Other times it would simply asphyxiate people in buildings they thought were safe, the gas displacing oxygen, people going to sleep and never waking up because they'd been breathing gas instead of air. The smell of coal gas was distinctive, but in an environment already full of smoke and dust and chemical smells, it was easy to miss until too late. The specific experience of being in an underground station that was hit, like Balham or Bank, deserves deeper examination, because drowning in a tunnel is uniquely horrific. The explosion would breach the tunnel, and whatever was above, water or sewage or rubble or all three, would pour in. The lights went out immediately, so you were in total darkness. The sound of rushing water echoed and amplified in the tunnel, deafening and disorienting. People would panic, trying to reach exits that were either blocked by debris or jammed with other panicking people, creating human stampede. The water came from multiple directions, filling the tunnel faster than people could move, especially considering most were elderly or children or infirm, the young healthy being away in military service. You'd struggle against the current, trying to keep your footing, but the force of water would knock you down. Once down, in darkness, with hundreds of people around you, also panicking, getting back up was nearly impossible. People would step on you, push you under trying to save themselves, and you'd drown in a few feet of water because you couldn't stand up against the chaos. The children in these situations died first because they were shortest, the water covering them when it was still knee-high on adults. Parents would try to hold children above water, but as the water rose and the panic increased and exhaustion set in, some parents lost grip on their children, and the children disappeared into the churning darkness and drowned. The parental survivors of these disasters carried unbearable guilt, knowing intellectually they couldn't have done more, but feeling emotionally like they murdered their own children by failing to hold on. The rescue efforts in flooded tubes were nearly impossible because the water had to be pumped out before bodies could be reached, and that took days. By the time rescuers got in, the bodies had been in water for days, decomposing rapidly, bloated and discoloured and frequently unidentifiable. The recovery was gruesome, pulling corpses from mud and debris, trying to maintain dignity while handling human remains that were barely recognisable as human. The smell was indescribable, death and sewage and stagnant water, so thick it felt like a physical barrier you had to push through. The firefighters during the Blitz faced particular dangers that deserved specific attention. The fire service was overwhelmed from the first night, and stayed that way for the duration. When hundreds of fires started simultaneously from incendiary bombs, there weren't enough firefighters or equipment to address them all. Triage decisions had to be made, which fires to fight, which to let burn. Strategic buildings got priority, residential areas often didn't. So firefighters would work to save a warehouse while watching nearby homes burn, knowing people might be inside those homes but unable to help because resources had to be allocated strategically, not compassionately. The physical experience of fighting firestorms was extreme. The heat was so intense it would blister skin from yards away. Firefighters wore protective gear, but it was inadequate against firestorm temperatures that could exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius. Breathing was difficult even with masks because the air itself was superheated, and inhaling it damaged lungs. The fire would create its own wind, pulling air toward it so violently that firefighters would have to brace themselves against being pulled into the flames. Water from hoses would evaporate before reaching the fire, turning to steam that burned as badly as flames. The water supply problems complicated firefighting impossibly. Bombs would destroy water mains, leaving hydrants dry. Firefighters would have to run hoses from the Thames, sometimes miles from fire sites, and the water pressure would be inadequate by the time it reached the fire. Multiple pumps chained together could improve pressure, but reduced water volume. The calculations of hydraulics and logistics had to be done in real time, while buildings burned and bombs fell, making impossible decisions about resource allocation, while people died in fires you couldn't reach or couldn't stop. The firefighter casualties were significant. Buildings would collapse while firefighters were inside or adjacent. Flames would shift direction, suddenly trapping crews. Water tanks on damaged buildings would rupture, drowning firefighters in deluge of boiling water. The roof collapse was particular hazard, buildings burning from inside, weakening structures until roofs suddenly caved in, giving no warning, burying firefighters in burning debris. Over 300 firefighters died during the Blitz, and thousands more were injured, burned, crushed, or suffered smoke inhalation damage that caused lifelong respiratory problems. The auxiliary firefighters, volunteers without extensive training, performed remarkably, but died at higher rates than professional firefighters because they lacked experience to read building conditions and predict collapses. Young women served as fire watchers and auxiliary crew, operating pumps and running hoses, some as young as 18, doing dangerous work while bombs fell. Several were killed, either by direct bomb hits or by building collapses. Their bravery was genuine, and their deaths were tragic, and their contribution was essential, but under-recognized because auxiliary services were seen as less important than military service. The telephone operators and communication workers maintained connection between rescue services while under bombardment. The telephone exchanges were priority targets because disrupting communications would paralyze civil defense. Operators stayed at switchboards in buildings that were being bombed, continuing to connect calls and relay information while ceilings collapsed and walls shook. Several exchanges took direct hits, killing everyone inside. The operators knew they were targets, knew staying was dangerous, but they stayed because without communications, rescue coordination would fail and more people would die. The doctors and nurses in emergency hospitals, already discussed but worth elaborating, worked under conditions that violated every principle of medical best practice. Sterility was impossible when operations happened in damaged buildings with no running water. Anesthesia shortages meant painful procedures done on conscious or barely sedated patients. Blood transfusions required direct donor to patient transfer because blood banking was primitive, meaning finding compatible donors during emergencies was difficult and time-consuming. Antibiotics didn't exist yet, penicillin only becoming available late in the war, so infection rates were high and many patients who survived initial treatment died days later from sepsis. The specific medical challenges of blast injuries were poorly understood early in the Blitz. Blast lung, the damage caused by pressure waves, wasn't immediately recognized because external injuries were minimal. Patients would arrive seeming relatively okay, just shocked and bruised, and then deteriorate rapidly as internal bleeding and lung damage manifested. By the time symptoms appeared, treatment options were limited. Many blast lung patients died despite medical intervention because the damage was too severe, and the treatments didn't exist yet to address it effectively. The psychiatric casualties, the people who broke mentally rather than physically, were treated poorly by 1940 standards. The understanding of trauma was limited and often moralistic. Mental breakdown was seen as weakness or cowardice rather than injury. Treatment consisted mostly of sedation and rest, basically warehousing people in psychiatric facilities until they improved or didn't. The medications used were crude, often making patients worse through side effects. Talk therapy existed, but wasn't widely available or covered by medical services. Most people with trauma-related mental illness just lived with it, untreated, self-medicating with alcohol, or struggling through without support. The long-term physical health effects of the Blitz are still being studied. Chronic stress causes measurable damage to cardiovascular and immune systems. People who lived through the Blitz had higher rates of heart disease, strokes, and cancer in later life compared to cohorts who didn't experience similar stress. The mechanism is partly direct, stress hormones causing physical damage, and partly behavioral, traumatized people engaging in unhealthy coping behaviors like smoking, drinking, and poor diet. The Blitz killed some people immediately, and others slowly over decades, the stress shortening lifespans even when direct injury didn't occur. The reproductive effects of stress on Blitz survivors are documented. Women who were pregnant during the Blitz had higher rates of miscarriage, premature birth, and low birth weight babies. The stress hormones crossed placental barrier and affected fetal development. Some effects were immediate. Babies born during the Blitz had measurably higher rates of health problems. Other effects were long-term, those babies growing into adults with higher rates of mental illness and chronic disease, the prenatal stress exposure affecting lifelong health trajectories. The economic impact of the Blitz on individual families was catastrophic and permanent for many. Lost wages from injuries, medical costs, property loss. These combined to destroy household economies. The working class, living paycheck to paycheck before the war, had no reserves to handle financial shocks. Losing a home meant losing everything, and starting over was impossible without capital. Many families never recovered economically, living in poverty for the rest of their lives because the Blitz destroyed their economic foundation. And post-war economy didn't provide enough opportunity to rebuild. The disabled survivors, people with permanent injuries from bombs, faced world not designed for disability. Prosthetics were crude and uncomfortable. Wheelchairs were basic, and many buildings were inaccessible. Employment discrimination meant disabled people couldn't find work easily. Government disability pensions were minimal, inadequate to live on. So disabled Blitz survivors lived in poverty and social marginalization. Their sacrifice acknowledged verbally, but not supported materially. They'd saved the country allegedly, but the country didn't particularly take care of them afterward. The widows and orphans faced similar neglect. Widow pensions were minimal. Orphanages were overcrowded and underfunded. The children who lost parents were traumatized and impoverished simultaneously, growing up in institutions or with relatives who often resented having extra mouths to feed. These children faced reduced life prospects, less education, fewer opportunities, higher rates of poverty and crime, and early death. The Blitz created underclass of damaged survivors who never got help they needed and spent their lives struggling with consequences they didn't choose. The veterans returning from war found that civilian Blitz survivors had legitimacy in claiming wartime suffering that sometimes exceeded military veterans' claims. This created tension. Soldiers felt their service and sacrifice should be paramount. Civilians felt their suffering was equally valid, and perhaps worse because it included children and elderly who had no choice. The competition for recognition and resources between military and civilian survivors was ugly and unproductive. Everyone deserving support. Not enough support available, so they fought over scraps, instead of demanding adequate provision for all. The storytelling about the Blitz became codified into acceptable narratives. You could talk about the bravery, the resilience, the pulling together. You couldn't talk about the panic, the cowardice, the times when people failed morally. The sanitized version became official history, taught to children, commemorated in ceremonies. The complicated truth became private knowledge, shared only among those who were there, gradually dying with them. The gap between public memory and private reality is where the real history lives, messy and human and true. And now, more than 80 years later, the last survivors are dying. The children of the Blitz are in their 80s and 90s. Soon there will be no one left who remembers it directly. The transition from living memory to historical record is happening now. What gets preserved and how it gets told will shape how future generations understand it. The danger is that sanitized inspiring version becomes the only version. The complexity erased, the real suffering and real trauma simplified into easy lesson about resilience. But the real lesson of the Blitz isn't about resilience. It is about what war does to civilians. It is about the costs of decisions made by leaders who don't pay them. It is about the randomness of survival and death in situations where nothing you do matters much. Your fate determined by which building a bomb hits, which shelter you choose, which direction you run when panic strikes. It is about trauma that lasts lifetimes, about survival that comes with unbearable costs, about human capacity to endure horror that should never have to be endured. The Blitz was terror bombing, intentionally targeting civilians to break national will. It failed to break Britain, but succeeded in killing tens of thousands and traumatizing hundreds of thousands. The same strategy applied to Germany later in the war killed many more civilians and also failed to break enemy will. The lesson that terror bombing doesn't work and primarily just murders civilians has been repeatedly ignored. Bombing civilian populations continues in modern warfare, the same strategy failing again and again, but continuing because it feels like it should work and because alternatives require more difficult choices. If we remember the Blitz only as inspiring story of resilience, we miss the point. The point is that it shouldn't have happened. That bombing civilians is wrong regardless of strategic justification. That the cost in human suffering is too high for any claimed benefit. That the people who lived through it survived not because they were special or because their nation was great, but because humans survived terrible things by necessity. And survival doesn't mean thriving or even healing fully. The sirens, the shelters, the destroyed homes, the burning city, the dead and the living damaged, all of it was real. It happened to real people living real lives, who didn't ask for war or expect to become collateral damage in strategic bombing campaigns. They endured because endurance was only option. They survived when survival was partly luck and partly stubborn refusal to die. And they carried what happened to them for the rest of their lives. The trauma never fully resolved, the losses never fully accepted, the experience shaping everything that came after. So remember it that way. Remember it as it was, not as we prefer it to have been. Remember the specific individuals who died specific deaths. Remember the survivors who carried specific wounds. Remember the complexity and the horror and the humanity struggling to maintain itself against circumstances designed to destroy it. Remember that it was terrible and should not happen again, and then work to make sure it doesn't. Because inspiration without action is just comfortable. Lie we tell ourselves to avoid responsibility. The experience varied significantly across different London neighbourhoods, creating multiple simultaneous but different blitzes. The East End, as mentioned, was bombed heavily because of the docks, but also because it was densely populated with working class housing built cheaply and close together. When fires started in the East End, they spread building to building easily, entire blocks burning in single night. The narrow streets made firefighting difficult, hoses couldn't reach, and residents couldn't evacuate quickly when fires spread faster than people could move. The West End, wealthier and more spread out, had better, built buildings that resisted fire and blast better. The wider streets allowed better evacuation and firefighting access. The residents had more resources, private shelters, ability to evacuate to country, estates. So the wealthy experienced a less severe blitz than the poor, not because German bombers discriminated, but because wealth provided protection that poverty didn't. This inequality in suffering created lasting resentment, the sense that the celebrated shared sacrifice wasn't actually shared equally. The docks themselves, the industrial heart of London, were primary targets throughout the Blitz. The Luftwaffe wanted to disrupt shipping and supply chains, so the docks took concentrated bombing. The dock workers, essential workers who couldn't evacuate and had to keep working despite danger, faced extraordinary risks. Loading and unloading ships while bombs fell required either extraordinary bravery or such desperate economic need that the risk was acceptable compared to losing wages. Many dock workers were killed at their jobs, crushed by falling cargo or blown apart by direct hits. The ships in the Thames and docks were targets themselves. Several were hit and sank or burned at anchor. A ship loaded with munitions exploding created secondary disaster, the blast equivalent to massive bomb, destroying nearby ships and dock facilities. The sailors and dock workers on or near these ships when they exploded were instantly killed, vaporized or dismembered by the force. The cleanup afterward involved pulling body parts from the Thames for days, the river literally running with debris and blood. The River Thames itself became hazardous during the Blitz. The fires lit the river in reflection, turning it red and orange, creating apocalyptic scene. The water was filled with debris, bodies, oil slicks that would ignite if hit by incendiaries. The bridges were bombed, several damaged or destroyed, disrupting transportation across the river. The Thames, normally London's commercial lifeline, became barrier that divided the city and hazard that killed people who tried to use it for escape or firefighting water source. The underground stations each developed their own cultures and social structures during their time as shelters. Some stations were well organized with volunteer committees that maintained order, distributed supplies, arranged entertainment. These stations became functional temporary communities with rules and norms and social hierarchies. Other stations were chaotic, overcrowded, unmanaged, and the experience there was much worse. The luck of which station you sheltered insignificantly affected your Blitz experience. The entertainment in shelters ranged from impromptu sing-alongs to organized concerts by professional musicians. The Myra Hess lunchtime concerts at the National Gallery, performed throughout the Blitz, became famous symbols of cultural resistance. People would attend concerts between raids, listening to classical music while knowing bombs might fall at any moment. The defiance of maintaining cultural life amid destruction was genuine and meaningful, not propaganda, but real human need for beauty and normalcy even in hell. The religious services in shelters provided comfort for believers, but also highlighted absence of divine protection. Priests and ministers held services on tube platforms, leading prayers for protection that often went unanswered. The theological gymnastics required to explain why God allowed innocents to suffer created cognitive dissonance that some faithful navigated and others couldn't. The question, where was God, haunted many and was never satisfactorily answered, leading to crisis of faith for some and strengthened conviction for others, through mechanisms that remain mysterious. The children's adaptation to shelter life showed remarkable and disturbing flexibility. Kids would play games in tunnels, make friends, create routines around the abnormal. This adaptability was a survival mechanism, but also meant children normalized trauma, incorporating violence and death into their understanding of normal life. The long-term effect was generation that grew up thinking war and bombing were standard childhood experiences, and adjusting to peacetime normalcy was as jarring as the initial adjustment to war had been. The education in shelters was haphazard and voluntary. Some teachers conducted impromptu lessons, teaching reading and arithmetic by candlelight on platform floors. The curriculum was whatever the teacher remembered or thought important, often simplified dramatically because materials and space were limited. Most children received fragmented education at best, and the knowledge gaps created by wartime disruption affected their life prospects permanently. The children who missed years of schooling due to evacuation or BLITZ disruption entered adult workforce undereducated and competed poorly against those whose education hadn't been interrupted. The medical care available in shelters was minimal. First aid posts were established in larger stations, staffed by volunteers with basic training. Serious medical emergencies had to be transported to hospitals, but during raids, transportation was dangerous or impossible, so people died in shelters from conditions that would have been treatable in hospitals. The deaths from medical conditions rather than bombing, heart attacks and strokes and diabetic emergencies and childbirth complications weren't counted as BLITZ casualties, but were direct results of circumstances created by bombing. The births that occurred in shelters, babies delivered on tube platforms with minimal medical support, were simultaneously hopeful and tragic. New life beginning amid death, babies born into a world of sirens and explosions, first experiences being shelter smell and shelter sounds. The survival rate for shelter births was lower than hospital births, but many babies survived and grew into people whose first environment was wartime shelter, carrying that origin story forever. The elderly in shelters faced particular indignities beyond physical discomfort. Loss of privacy, inability to maintain personal hygiene standards, dependence on strangers for basic needs, all eroded dignity that elderly people had maintained throughout long lives. Many elderly said they preferred to die in their homes than lose dignity in shelters, and some did exactly that, choosing to remain in houses, despite danger, because dignity mattered more than safety. This choice was respected by some and condemned by others as selfish or cowardly. But it was fundamentally about autonomy and maintaining self-determination, even when circumstances made it costly. The disabled people in shelters faced accessibility issues that made already difficult situation worse. Wheelchairs couldn't navigate tube stairs easily. Blind people couldn't orient themselves in darkness and chaos. Deaf people couldn't hear warnings or instructions. The provisions for disability were minimal or absent, the assumption being that able-bodied people would help, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't depending on overcrowding and panic levels. Some disabled people died in shelters, not from bombs but from being trampled or knocked down in crowds that didn't see them or couldn't avoid them. The mental hospitals and asylums during the Blitz faced horrific dilemmas. The patients, already mentally ill, were terrified by bombing and couldn't understand what was happening or why. The staff had to manage hundreds of panicking patients while also dealing with their own fear. Several mental institutions were bombed directly, killing patients who couldn't evacuate themselves. The ethical questions about whether and how to evacuate psychiatric patients, whether sedation was humane or necessary, whether restraints were protective or abusive, were never satisfactorily resolved, and decisions were made situationally with varying results. The prisons faced similar issues. Prisoners couldn't evacuate during raids, the security requirements preventing movement, so prisoners were locked in cells while bombs fell, completely helpless, unable to shelter or escape if the prison was hit. Several prisons took hits, killing prisoners in cells they couldn't leave. The ethics of this, leaving prisoners locked up to die, was uncomfortable, but the alternative of releasing them was unacceptable to authorities. So prisoners died trapped, which seemed cruel, even within framework of war. The industrial accidents that occurred during the Blitz, factories damaged causing chemical releases or explosions, created additional casualties beyond direct bombing. One munitions factory hit by bomb exploded catastrophically, killing hundreds of workers and destroying surrounding neighborhood. The explosion was so large, it was mistaken for earthquake. The bodies were so thoroughly destroyed that identification was impossible for many, and families never got remains to bury. The industrial Blitz casualties were often omitted from official figures, because attributing them to bombing versus industrial accident was complicated. The food poisoning and contamination during the Blitz killed significant numbers through indirect pathways. Refrigeration failed when power was disrupted. Meat spoiled. Grocers sold it anyway because wasting food was unthinkable. People ate contaminated food because they were hungry and alternatives didn't exist. The resulting food poisoning killed vulnerable people, elderly and young and already ill, who might have survived the illness under normal circumstances, but couldn't, while also dealing with stress and deprivation and disrupted medical care. The tuberculosis and other infectious diseases spread rapidly in shelters where thousands of people breathed the same air for hours nightly. TB was already a problem before the war, but the shelter conditions accelerated transmission dramatically. The chronic coughing in shelters wasn't just from dust, it was from TB spreading through the population. Many people contracted TB in shelters and died from it months or years later, the Blitz killing them on delayed timeline that doesn't show up in casualty statistics. The influenza and pneumonia that spread in shelters were similarly deadly. The close quarters, the stress-weakening immune systems, the cold and damp conditions, all contributed to respiratory infections. The very young and very old died disproportionately from these infections. The 1918 Spanish flu was recent memory, and fear of another pandemic was real. But fortunately nothing that severe emerged, though seasonal flu waves during the Blitz years killed more people than typical seasons because of the environmental stress. The lice infestations in shelters were universal and inevitable. Thousands of people in close quarters with minimal washing facilities meant lice spread quickly. Delousing efforts were attempted but largely futile, given the conditions. Everyone had lice. The itching was constant and maddening. The social stigma of lice infestation evaporated, because literally everyone was infested. This normalization of conditions that would have been unacceptable before the war showed how quickly standards adjust downward when circumstances demand it. The rats in shelters and bombed buildings were another hazard. Destruction of buildings disrupted rat populations, driving them into shelters and homes, seeking food. The rat population exploded during the Blitz, feeding on debris and food, waste and occasionally corpses that hadn't been recovered yet. Rat bites and diseases transmitted by rats caused additional health problems. Poison was used but couldn't keep up with reproduction rates. The rats became accepted part of environment, another unpleasant fact of life, like lice and darkness and fear. The sound environment of the Blitz, beyond the obvious sirens and explosions, included constant lower-level noise that created cumulative stress. The droning of aircraft engines overhead, sometimes for hours as waves of bombers passed. The anti-aircraft guns firing continuously, creating rhythmic booming that shook buildings. The sound of falling debris after explosions, tinkling and crashing and rumbling that continued for minutes after each bomb. The crying and shouting and praying of thousands of people in shelters. The noise was relentless, making sleep nearly impossible, even during lulls when bombing paused. The silence that fell after the all clear was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. Your ears would ring from hours of explosive sounds. The sudden quiet felt wrong, empty, and you'd strain to hear if it was really over or just a lull. The transition from noise to silence happened abruptly when sirens stopped, and the auditory shock of sudden quiet after hours of chaos was disorienting. Some people reported the silence being harder to handle than the noise because it meant emerging to see damage. The smell environment shifted throughout a raid. Initially you'd smell smoke from fires, acrid and chemical. As raid continued, you'd smell explosives, a distinctive sharp smell from detonated bombs. Later you'd smell gas from ruptured lines, sweet and sickly. In shelters you'd smell human bodies, sweat and waste and fear. After raids climbing out, you'd smell dust and brick, and occasionally something worse when bodies were in the rubble. Your nose adapted to each smell eventually, but the adaptation was incomplete, and you remained aware of unpleasant sensory environment. even when not consciously registering it. The taste in your mouth during and after raids was dust and smoke and chemical residue. You'd drink water or tea and taste sediment and chemicals from damaged pipes. Food would taste like dust because dust settled on everything. The persistent bad taste contributed to nausea and loss of appetite that many people experienced, leading to weight loss and malnutrition, even when rations were adequate, because eating food that tastes like burning building and dust was difficult, despite hunger. The tactile environment was dominated by brick dust covering every surface. Everything you touched was gritty. Your clothes were stiff with dried sweat and dust. Your skin felt perpetually dirty because washing was inadequate. Your hands were rough from handling debris and working without gloves because gloves weren't available or wore out quickly. The physical sensory unpleasantness was constant, minor compared to fear of death, but accumulating into significant quality of life reduction that made every moment uncomfortable. The visual environment after raids was colorless, everything covered in grey dust that homogenized the scene. The fires added orange and red glow at night, garish and unnatural. The searchlights crisscrossing the sky created moving shadows and strange lighting effects. In shelters, the dim lighting created murky gloom, where you couldn't see clearly. Faces becoming indistinct, identity becoming unclear. Humanity reduced to shadows and shapes in darkness. The papers and propaganda posters that survived showing smiling, cheerful people, maintaining morale, looked increasingly absurd compared to actual reality. The disconnect between poster messages and lived experience became dark humor source. You'd see poster telling you to keep calm and carry on, while standing in rubble of your destroyed home, and the absurdity would either make you laugh bitterly, or cry, or both. The propaganda kept coming because maintaining narrative was considered essential, but believers in the propaganda became fewer as war continued, and reality contradicted messaging repeatedly. The graffiti that appeared on ruins showed authentic public sentiment better than official propaganda. Hitler can't take our pride alongside. Fucking hell, not again, showed the range of responses. Some graffiti was defiant, some despairing, some darkly funny. Nice try, Adolf. Try again tomorrow. On a damaged but standing building. At least the rent's reduced, on a house missing its entire front wall. The humor was coping mechanism, but also genuine human response to absurdity of situations. The looting problem was worse than officially acknowledged. The number of people who stole from bombed properties, including police and art wardens, who were supposed to prevent looting, was significant. Some looters were opportunistic criminals. Others were desperate people taking necessities they couldn't obtain otherwise. The moral line between looting and salvaging was blurry. If a shop was destroyed and goods would be lost anyway, was taking canned food looting or resourcefulness? Authorities said looting, but hungry people said survival, and prosecutions happened, but convictions were difficult, because juries sympathized with defendants. The betrayals that occurred during the Blitz, people acting selfishly or cruelly when circumstances created opportunity, were numerous, but rarely discussed because they contradicted the Blitz spirit narrative. Landlords evicting tenants whose homes were destroyed so they could rent to someone else at higher rates. Employers firing workers who couldn't get to work due to bombing disruption. Families refusing to take in relatives, made homeless. These selfish acts happened alongside the celebrated mutual aid and heroism. But remembering them is uncomfortable, so they get edited out of popular memory. The sexual violence that occurred during the chaos was another uncomfortable truth. Bombed buildings, darkness, social order breaking down. These created opportunities for predators. Women and girls were assaulted in shelters during evacuations, in damaged buildings, by strangers and sometimes by authority figures who were supposed to protect them. The reporting rate was low because women were rarely believed, and prosecution was rare. The number of sexual assaults during the Blitz will never be known, but was certainly higher than official records suggest. The black market became parallel economy during the Blitz, trading everything from food to petrol to stolen goods. If you had money and connections, you could get almost anything, despite rationing and shortages. The black market enabled survival for some but also deepened inequality, the wealthy able to buy their way around restrictions while the poor adhered to rationing. Authorities attempted crackdowns, but the market was too widespread and too useful. Even officials participated sometimes, making enforcement inconsistent. The counterfeit ration coupons and identity papers circulated widely. Forging documents became minor industry. The quality ranged from terrible to excellent, and distinguishing real from fake was difficult even for authorities. Some people used fake documents for legitimate purposes, replacing lost papers or supplementing inadequate rations for large families. Others used them criminally, selling coupons or adopting false identity. The document fraud was so common that official statistics about population and rations were unreliable. Estimates rather than accurate counts. The theft from bodies already mentioned, but worth elaborating, was shocking in its prevalence. Rescue workers, police, medical staff, and civilians all participated in robbing the dead. Jewelry, wallets, watches, anything valuable was stolen before bodies reached morgues. Some theft was opportunistic greed. Some was rationalized as, they don't need it anymore, or their family will never know. Some was simple survival, desperate people taking resources wherever they could find them. The violations of the dead showed how completely normal moral standards had broken down for some people. The execution of the 2 wartime hangings for looting showed how seriously authorities took property crime, even while human lives were being destroyed wholesale. The men hanged had been caught looting from bombed property. Their executions were intended as deterrent, but instead created martyrs and increased resentment toward authorities, seen as protecting property over people. The death penalty for looting when thousands were dying from bombs seemed disproportionate and cruel, and public opinion turned against it, forcing authorities to reduce sentences for later looters to long imprisonment, rather than death. The psychological manipulation in propaganda accelerated during the Blitz with mixed results. Authorities tried to shape public perception to maintain morale and prevent panic. The censorship of bad news, the emphasis on heroic stories, the suppression of information about disasters like Bethnal Green, all aimed to control narrative. But the gap between propaganda and lived reality was too wide, and people increasingly distrusted official information, knowing it was selective at best and dishonest at worst. The credibility damage to government communication lasted beyond the war. The celebrity involvement in relief efforts brought attention and resources, but also highlighted class divisions. Famous actors and aristocrats toured bombed areas, offering sympathy and sometimes organizing fundraisers. Well-intentioned but often tone-deaf, these visits felt patronizing to survivors who needed material assistance, not celebrity attention. King George V and Queen Elizabeth visited bombed neighborhoods repeatedly, and their persistence gained respect. But other high-profile visits felt like photo opportunities exploiting tragedy for propaganda value. The international response to the Blitz was mixed. Allied countries expressed sympathy, and some provided material aid. Neutral countries reported on the bombing with varying degrees of accuracy and sympathy, depending on their sympathies and relationships with Britain and Germany. The propaganda value of the Blitz for both sides created competing narratives. British sources claimed resilience and determination. German sources claimed devastation and military success. The truth was between them. Significant damage occurred, but Britain didn't collapse, making both narratives partly true and partly false. And finally, coming back to where we began, think about that siren, that rising and falling wail that meant terror was incoming. Every survivor remembered that sound. It appeared in their nightmares decades later. It triggered panic attacks when they heard similar sounds peacetime, ambulances or factory whistles or anything with that wavering quality. That sound was Pavlovian conditioning associating a specific noise with mortal danger, and that conditioning never fully faded. The siren lived in their nervous systems forever, a permanent scar on their fight, or flight response that made true relaxation impossible for the rest of their lives. That is what the Blitz was. All of this, every specific detail, every individual experience, every death and trauma and adaptation and survival. Not a symbol or lesson or inspiration, but a historical reality that killed tens of thousands and damaged hundreds of thousands, and should be remembered as it actually was: terrible, complex, human, and preventable. The people who lived through it deserve to be remembered as complete humans, not simplified into heroes or victims, but recognized as people who endured the unendurable and carried the cost forever.